Okay. Okay. So the topic of this talk was suggested by the people from the Mahabodhi Society, and I hope it won't get me into trouble with anybody. But there's a concept that the late congressional representative John Lewis used the expression "good trouble," getting into good trouble, and I've gotten into a fair amount of good trouble recently. If you happened to see when I went to join the monks from the Walk for Peace in Washington, D.C., at the American University, the lead monk, Venerable Panyakara, asked me to come up to the stage to speak. And then I gave just a little talk about 3 minutes, and I mentioned some of the things that I'm going to mention in the talk here. And there was an YouTube news channel that was videoing my talk. I was not really aware of that. And then they put up the segment on YouTube with the title Buddhist Monk at DC Event Slams XXX Administration in Fiery Speech. And it's sort of not my character. I don't slam anybody, and I didn't mention any names, but this is the way the news site has to generate what they call clickbait by using a provocative title to get people interested. Yeah. And then in the National Cathedral, it was just the same, it was actually the same, yeah, the afternoon of the same day. Then somebody in the audience asked the Peace Walk monks about how do you reconcile inner peace with social justice? And then Venerable Panyakara asked me to come up to deal with that question. And just you know, a few weeks before that, the ICE agents in Minnesota were grabbing people off the streets, and a few of the defenders were shot and killed. And so I spoke about that. And I said, what's going on in America now is approaching a reign of terror. And then again, some news site put a video of that talk, or maybe it was an Instagram, because I don't use Instagram, so I didn't see it, but somebody told me, put an Instagram of the talk with the words blazoned against my image, monks, monks speaks of America undergoing a reign of terror. And I thought I had to go into hiding for a couple of weeks. Otherwise, some guys would be coming to my room at the monastery saying, would you come down to Washington? We have to speak to you. And then I would find myself deported to some Central American El Salvador? I've never heard of the place.
The mind is
Yeah,
making stories.
yeah. Okay, so I'm going to be treating, I'm in a very unprofessional way. I'm not a social critic, a social theorist, political philosopher, but just drawing upon first some of the canonical texts dealing with the Buddha's conception of the appropriate social order, social and political order that conforms with Dharma, then looking at what's going on in the United States today and see what ideas we could come up with how to deal with this. Sometimes people, yeah, we always sort of in all of the Buddhist texts that are presented to the general public and in the Buddhist circles, the emphasis is always on the Buddha's teachings on meditation, philosophical teachings, maybe the personal ethical teachings, but often we leave out or don't pay attention to the Buddha's teachings on social matters and even teachings with political relevance. But there are texts like that that you could find in the suttas and then developed in some of the commentaries and in the living Buddhist tradition, as we'll see. Yeah, so we don't have the screen, so I can't uh, display them visually, but I'll just read some of the essential passages. And so we know, from the reading of the Pali text, it would be useful to have also, I think maybe Thomas went to get some water when my throat gets dry. Okay. So we find two dominant systems of political administration among the states in ancient India in the Buddha's time in Northeast India. One with a smaller kind of republican states. These are the kind of republics, not for, we wouldn't call them democracies, and that it's very unlikely that the general population had any kind of input into the government, but the government would be administered probably by the aristocratic clan within those states. And the most prominent one was called the Vajjian Confederacy, which was a confederacy of several republic type states. And when the Buddha came to the Vajjian community, then he gave them advice on how they should administer their state. So he lays down 7 principles by which he says that the the Lichavis were the dominant clan, and that's in that confederacy can be expected to prosper and not decline. So he says that they should assemble often and hold frequent assemblies, that they should assemble in harmony, conduct the affairs of the community in harmony, and then adjourn their meetings in harmony. So this emphasizes, you might say, okay, we don't want to take any line messages, please. Okay, this is coming from Australia. Okay. So this emphasizes, I guess, the importance of some kind of consensus amongst at least the leading, we say, the representatives in the state. And in developing a consensus, you have to be willing to make compromises, concessions, to listen to other people's points of view, and accept what is fair, what is reasonable, and what one knows is going to contribute to the greatest good of the community. Not for one faction to insist on its own point of view, try to override the opposing points of view, but to work together to create a flourishing, harmonious community in which everyone can feel satisfied with the end result. Among the principles the Buddha lays down for, oops, I lost it. For the Vajjayans, he says, as long as they honor, respect, esteem, and venerate the elders of the community, growth is to be expected, not decline. So this shows that there's a certain, respect for the wisdom of the elders. And amongst them, he says that as long as the Vajjayans do not abduct women and girls from their families and force them to live with them. So this shows that in a healthy community that there's respect for women and girls. And when we think of this in the light of what goes on in things like the Epstein issue, where this was like leading members of the American, not only American, but global society were involved with Jeffrey Epstein and with the send her a message to cool it. I'm giving it. Sorry about. Okay, so the importance of protecting the women and girls, and I would say applied to contemporary society, this would involve not simply protecting women and girls, but giving them a respected place in conducting the affairs of the society, especially in the social and political system, giving women the opportunity to make important and major contributions to the conducting of the affairs of the community. And then it says also, as long as the Vajjayans provide protection, shelter, and guard for arahants, so that arahants who have not yet come might arrive, and arahants who are already there might continue to dwell there at ease, then growth is to be expected, not decline. I don't know how the Buddha would have expected the Vajjayas to know who are arahants or who are not. But I think we could say, maybe he's using the word arahants there not to mean necessarily those who have attained like the final stage in the development of the path. We could say respected spiritual practitioners. Um, so this shows the need, I would say, for a healthy community to respect the spiritual traditions, the religions, and to give due support to practitioners of the different spiritual forms of spirituality and religion, as long as they are leading upright and virtuous lives and promoting healthy and wholesome principles that accord with Dharma in the general sense, not the exclusively Buddhist sense, but in ancient India, this would include the Buddhists, the Jainas, the non-pretentious Brahmins, but the sort of the religiously devout Brahmins and the Shramanas or renunciants of the other traditions. So these are the teachings that the Buddha gives to the Vajjayans who sort of represent the republic form of government. But we also find what's taking place during the Buddha's time is that the small tribal republics are tending to coalesce, and the republican form of administration is getting replaced by an ascending monarchical form of government, with larger states emerging and with dominated by powerful kings. And so we have two powerful kingdoms during the Buddha's time, in which the Buddha often lived and taught. One was the state of Magadha to the east, with its capital at Rajagaha or Rajgir. And earlier king was King Bimbisara, who was a devout supporter of the Buddha. And then he was replaced by his son, who usurped the throne and killed his father, Ajatasattu, but later became a supporter of the Sangha. And then the other major kingdom was to the northwest, and that is the state of Savatthi, or the state of Kosala, with the capital of Savatthi, and the king there is King Pasenadi. And so probably the Buddha foresaw the sort of the danger and the rise of powerful monarchies. And so he wanted to establish, using a kind of legendary framework, a model of virtuous rule, monarchical rule. So he establishes the idea of what is called the Chakravarti Raja. This is the wheel-turning monarch, who we encounter in several suttas. And here I want to quote from several of the suttas on the wheel-turning monarch. So he says that this is the very important point, and then for understanding the Buddhist basis for, you say, the underlying foundation for a Buddhist political theory. So he says, even a wheel-turning monarch a just and righteous king does not govern his realm without a co-ruler. And so then the monk asks, who is the co-ruler of the wheel-turning monarch? And then the Buddha replies, it is the Dhamma. The wheel-turning monarch relies on the Dhamma, honors the Dhamma, esteems and respects the Dhamma, and then taking the Dhamma as his ruler, he provides righteous protection, shelter, and safety for everyone in his realm. People of all the different classes and castes, including the birds and the beasts. And then the text goes on to say, and that rule by the wheel-turning monarch, when he rules in accordance with Dhamma, it cannot be overthrown by any hostile human being. And the expression used here, interesting, it says, tang hoti chakang apatavatayam, that wheel cannot be, literally it means that wheel cannot be turned back. And that's exactly the same expression that occurs in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, when the Buddha first gives the first public discourse on the Dhamma to the five ascetics, then at the end, when all of the deities are applauding the Buddha's teaching, they say that that wheel of Dhamma cannot be turned back by any ascetic or Brahmin or Deva or Brahma deity or Mara or any other sentient living being. And so this, to my mind, implies that there are two aspects to the Dhamma. So I call one of them the world transcending aspect of the Dhamma, which would be like the philosophical teachings of the Four Noble Truths, and then the practical teaching of the Noble Eightfold Path with four foundations of mindfulness, Sila, Samadhi, Panya, leading to liberation. So that's the world transcending Dhamma. But then the other aspect of the Dhamma I call the world sustaining Dhamma. So this is the two aspects of the same Dhamma. So I compare this, it's like a pillar placed in the ground. So part of the pillar is in the ground, part of the pillar rises above the ground. So you could say the part of the pillar which is planted in the ground is the world-sustaining Dhamma, and the part of the pillar above the ground is the world-transcending Dhamma. And so what the Buddha emphasizes, of course, his unique role is to make known the world-transcending Dhamma. That's his special function. But the Buddha also teaches the world-sustaining Dhamma, which would be those principles of righteousness, goodness, virtue that support and sustain human beings and even other types of living beings in the day-to-day activities of their ordinary lives. And we can't sort of discard and throw out that world-sustaining Dhamma and just focus on the world-transcending Dhamma, because that world-sustaining Dhamma is, in a sense, the support for the world-transcending Dhamma. Like, of course, even in the chaotic, confused, maybe even tyrannical, dictatorial country, people can still learn Buddha Dhamma, sometimes secretly, practice with a great deal of fear and trepidation, or in a morally, maybe not a dictatorial country, but in a country which is subject to a lot of moral confusion, distraction, overrun by selfishness, greed, as people grasping and pursuing power and titles and fame. Still, virtuous people could still pursue and practice the Dhamma. but it's much more difficult. I would say that the Dhamma pursuit of the world transcending Dhamma really flourishes in a society in which the world sustaining Dhamma is respected and upheld, which is why I think the Buddha emphasizes the need for a government to adhere to the principles of the world sustaining Dhamma. And so here, just in a general way, the Buddha is saying that the wheel-turning monarch takes as his own ruler, his own Raja, his own king, is the Dhamma, which is that principle of righteousness, truth, goodness, justice that he has to embody and enact in his rule. And then the Buddha gives, well, some examples. How does the wheel-turning monarch conquer? Because the wheel-turning monarch in this legend becomes a world ruler exercising rulership over the four continents, but he does so not through violence, but through the power of his virtue. And so the legend, in this legendary discourse, the Buddha says that the wheel-turning monarch rolls his wheel treasure. You see, that wheel-turning monarch, the way he legitimates his rule, that some kind of magical, mystical wheel appears to him through the power of his virtue. And that sort of shining, bright, brilliant wheel just appears sort of out of thin air, and it legitimates his rule. But then he takes that wheel and he rolls it first to the eastern direction, and then the king of the east, the kings in the east, come to the wheel-turning monarch and they say, "You are welcome, great king. Come to us, command, advise us." And then the wheel-turning monarch doesn't just try to conquer them forcefully and oppress them, take all of their wealth into his own treasury, but he says, he gives them the five precepts. He does is don't kill, don't steal, don't commit sexual misconduct, don't lie, don't use intoxicants, but then go ahead and enjoy whatever you're accustomed to enjoy. And so then the kings in the east submit to the wheel-turning monarch, and then this goes on with the other directions, south, west, and north. And so in this way, the wheel-turning monarch becomes the universal ruler, but he allows the other kings to continue to administer their own territories as long as they continue to adopt and to uphold this world-sustaining Dhamma. Okay, and then an important sutta is in the Digha Nikaya, sutta number 26, where again the Buddha is recounting these legends about the wheel-turning monarchs, and he's speaking about a time in the past, long ago, centuries and centuries ago, when there was a wheel-turning monarch, and he was about, you see, when the wheel-turning monarch grows old, when he gets some gray hairs, then he decides, okay, it's time for me to retire and to go into the forest and become an ascetic. He doesn't want to run for re-election when he's reaching his late 70s and 80s, but gray hairs appear, maybe he's turning 55 or something. Then he thinks, okay, time for me to turn over the administration of the realm to my son. And so then the son will ask him, what is the duty of the wheel-turning monarch? And then the retiring king explains, this is the duty, that you should rely on the Dhamma, honor, respect, and esteem the Dhamma, provide righteous protection to everyone in your realm. So that's the general advice. Then he says, let no crime prevail in your realm. You should approach wise ascetics and Brahmins and ask them for their advice. Ask them what is good, what is bad, what's wholesome, what's unwholesome, what leads to harm, what leads to the well-being of the kingdom. And then he gives an important point. He says, let there be no poverty in your realm. If there are poor people, give them wealth, ensure that everybody has a satisfactory standard of living. So he says that's the duty of the wheel-turning monarch. And then the king turns over his realm to his son, shaves off his hair and beard, goes into the forest and becomes a samana or a rishi, an ascetic. And now what happens when the kingship is passed over to the son, the wheel disappears. The son doesn't automatically get the wheel treasure. So the son has to earn the wheel treasure by starting to administer the kingdom righteously. And as he does this, once he establishes a righteous realm, a righteous administration, and generally it's described in the suttas what what the aspirants to become a wheel-turning monarch do. They have to observe the Uposatha days. And on the Uposatha, what they do is they go into their upper chamber. They say to all of their attendants, their ministers, don't disturb me on the Uposatha day. I'm going up there to spend the day in meditation. The only one who comes is the one who brings me my food. And then he sits in meditation. And what does he do on those days? He practices the 4 Brahma Viharas. During this period, generally they don't have the Buddha's teaching available, so they're not doing Vipassana meditation, but they're doing the Brahma Vihara meditation. And so it's through the power of their metta, karuna, mudita, upekkha that they generate the virtuous power through which the wheel appears to them. And so in this sutta, that process of succession goes down through 7 generations until the 7th king who arises in this dynasty doesn't go to his father, the royal sage, to get advice. Instead, he rules according to his own ideas. And then the people do not prosper. And then the king starts to neglect the duties of a wheel-turning monarch. And especially, he doesn't give wealth to the poor. And so poverty becomes widespread in the realm. And once poverty increases, then all sorts of crime emerge, and then the whole social order starts to degenerate, violence erupts, and then kind of social chaos emerges in the realm. So this shows the importance in the proper administration that it's a responsibility, we could project it into modern times, for the government to ensure that there's no poverty in the country. And it's the duty of the government to uplift people from poverty, to ensure that everybody has a satisfactory standard of living. And then we say, I'll take like one more text of this particular genre. And this is also from the Digha Nikaya, Sutta number 5. Again, it's in the form of a legend where there was an ancient king and there was sort of disruptions in his realm. There were bandits and brigands raiding all of the villages and towns. And the king thinks the way that he can establish order is by performing a great sacrifice. So he starts to make preparations for a sacrifice. And then he goes to his minister for advice. And the minister says to him, Your Majesty, you think you're going to get rid of this plague of robbers by making this great sacrifice, by arresting them, imprisoning them, and executing them. That's not going to end this crime wave. If you want to get rid of this disruption in the realm, this is what you have to do. To those of your citizens who are engaged in agriculture, give them grain and fodder. To those engaged in business, give them capital so they could start their startup businesses, maybe some small computer companies. And to those in government service, pay them proper living wages. And then those people intent on their own occupations won't be dissatisfied with your realm. Then you'll have your revenue increase, the land will be peaceful, and there won't be an outbreak of thieves and bandits, and the people will be joyful in their hearts, living with open houses, opening the doors of their houses and playing with their children out in the streets. Okay, so that, and then we find in the Jataka stories, they enumerate what are called the 10 royal virtues. So here the Buddhist texts of the Jataka stories are setting up a certain model, ideal model for the kingship. These are the 10 qualities that a king should embody in himself. We could say that any ruler or any head of state should at least strive to emulate, even if they do so imperfectly. Okay, so we have dana, generosity, morality, then parichaga, which often means renunciation, but doesn't mean that, yeah, here I have rendered it as inward renunciation. So it doesn't mean that the king becomes an ascetic, but he has this attitude of sort of not being attached to wealth and possessions, fame and status, not trying to emblazon his name on every pillar, post, and dollar bills. I don't know if you know about the $250 bill, which is the honesty, performing his duties with honesty, gentleness, self-control, non-anger, no more tweets in the middle of the night, non-violence, forbearance, patience, and then respecting the opinions of others, avoiding bias, promoting public peace and order. So the 10 royal virtues. And then we find some attempts to embody this ideal of kingship in the great Buddhist emperor of the 3rd century BC. This is Emperor Ashoka, and we know about his realm through his edicts that he put up on pillars and rock inscriptions. Of course, we don't really know how Ashoka was perceived by his own citizens, but this is the way, the kind of model he set up for his own administration. So he says, I consider the welfare of all my subjects to be my primary duty. And my effort is directed to promoting the welfare of all the people. And whatever efforts I am making is to repay the debt I owe to all beings to ensure their happiness in this life and their attainment of heaven in the next life. And then he speaks about the things that he's done, that he's made gifts to Brahmins and ascetics. He's made gifts and supported the aged people. He's visited the people in the countryside, gave them instructions in the Dhamma, and he appointed yeah, he appointed certain ministers that he called Dhamma ministers, and they're not Buddhist missionaries. Their task is not to promote exclusively Buddhism, because the Ashoka had followers of many different religions or different spiritual systems within his realm, but there's a shared Indian conception of Dhamma as this fundamental, what I call the principle of righteousness and virtue, that all of them uphold, all of them endorse. And so the Buddha's Ashoka appoints these Dhamma ministers, and their task is to work among all religions for the establishment of Dhamma, for the promotion of Dhamma, and for the welfare and happiness of all who are devoted to Dhamma. And they work among soldiers, Brahmins, householders, the poor, the aged, for their welfare and happiness, so they may be free from oppression. They work for the proper treatment of prisoners, for the release of prisoners. And he gives in his edicts, he describes some of the tasks that he took upon himself. So he says, along the roads, I've had trees planted to give shade to travelers. I have had wells dug to provide water in areas without water. I've built rest houses. I have watering places made for the use of animals and human beings. He's built hospitals to provide medical treatment both for humans and animals. Yeah, it goes on and on. And then just to take another example, another source of information, ideas about a proper political administration coming from a Buddhist source. This is a work ascribed to the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, who's famous as the founder of the Madhyamaka school of Buddhist thought. But he has a work called the Ratnavali, the Precious Garland, which was written to a king of a South Indian kingdom. And he describes some of the duties of the king. So he says, you should win over the world only by means of Dharma, by giving, gentle speech, beneficent action, beneficent action, and collaboration with others, working in harmony with others. You should base your realm or your administration on the principles of truth, generosity, peace, and wisdom. And these are the duties of the king. He should establish schools and provide for the livelihood of school teachers, establish hostels, parks, ponds, and rest houses, provide care for the sick, orphans, and widows, the lowly and the poor, make medicines freely available, provide farmers with seeds and sustenance, reduce the tax rate, keep prices fair, provide clothes, adornments, and enjoyments to those in need, provide facilities for the study of Dharma, cause good qualities to grow in others, provide help to others without seeking any kind of reward, and always observe moral discipline yourself and generate the compassionate aspiration to enlightenment within yourself. So these are just a few examples of taking from classical sources on Buddhist political administration. So you see that there is this underlying foundation. And then I wanted to come to look now, coming from ancient times to our own modern situation, right here in America. I'm drawing some of the things that used when I gave the commencement talk at the Dharma Realm University. So I collected some information. So I gave my talk on the situation we're facing right here in the United States. Not, I'm not interested in partisan politics, but we have to look at our overarching social and political situation and really facing very dangerous conditions today, even the danger of kind of descent into an increasing authoritarianism. At least there's a push to establish a kind of authoritarian administration, autocracy, even tendencies towards undercover, towards a descent into fascism. We have to really be upfront about that. And I come just that's like so my basis for speaking about this. I come before I got involved with Buddhism. I come from the mid 1960s generation involved with the push against the war in Vietnam. We used to have something called SANE. It was a movement for the sane nuclear policy, for the abolition of nuclear weapons, advocating for civil rights, sort of supporting, at least inwardly and morally, the advancement of the efforts of the civil rights for the Black Americans, promoting the voting rights and so on. So that's really inspired me during my early years growing up. And then seeing, and at that particular period of my life, we were so hopeful. We thought that a really beautiful and bright age was coming with the United States. We had Bob Dylan singing "The times they are a changing, the new period is coming in." And seeing where we are today, so heartbreaking and disappointing. So some of the points that I made in my talk, I spoke about 5 challenges that we're facing today. And so the first of these is the accelerating transformation of this country from a very imperfect, flawed, defective, but at least aspirational democracy, turning into an oligarchy marked by enormous disparities of wealth and income. And then I have some figures. So as of 2025, the top 1% of Americans held $45 trillion in wealth, which is roughly the same as the total wealth held by the bottom 90% of the American population. And then interestingly, I had some figures. Let me see if I can find those. Yeah, this is from a talk that I gave, I think in 2019. And I draw on some figures from 2017, where I said that the 10 wealthiest men in America, and then in parentheses, they are all men, are collectively worth more than $633 billion. This is figures from 2017, but now I have the figure, the richest 10 Americans in 2025 are worth almost $3 trillion. In 2017, the richest 10 men are worth more than $600 billion. Today, Elon Musk is worth more than $600 billion, one man. So the richest 10 Americans are worth almost $3 trillion. And this is a difficult figure to accept, but it's been supported. Roughly 40% of the US population lives either in poverty, that's about 10%, or are living at a low income level, sort of just with like one family tragedy, one health emergency away from a plunge into poverty. So that's 28% are living just a little bit above the poverty level. 42 million people depend on SNAP, that's the food stamps program, to have enough food to put on the table for their families. 85 million people lack health insurance or are underinsured. 770 million people are homeless, living in homeless shelters or out on the streets. Even just last week, I was in Berkeley, walking through quite a prosperous neighborhood, but I see there's a square right below the Capitol, Berkeley Capitol, with a town hall, and people are sleeping out on the lawn. I see, Okay, but just this last July, Congress passed what they call this one big beautiful bill, but some call it this one big bullshit bill, which confers $1 trillion in tax breaks going mostly to the multimillionaires and billionaires, and to fund that one big beautiful bill. To fund those tax breaks, the bill makes massive cuts to Medicaid, to education, to the SNAP program, which is food assistance to the poor, and support for rural hospitals, which is extremely important because people living out in the countryside, in small towns, in villages, on farms, if they have a health emergency, not easy for them to get to the city to a big hospital. So they depend on these small hospitals. So if they have a critical health emergency, the rural hospitals are closed. They can't get to a big city hospital. So that's a matter of life and death. So it's going to really cause the death rate to increase through emergencies that can't be met because the rural hospitals are going out of business. And then sort of consequence of this sort of disparity of wealth is it reads this kind of dark mood that envelops so much of the population of this country. And as a result, when that dark mood envelops people's minds, it leads to some of the consequences of what they call these diseases of despair, increasing drug addiction. So we have all of these drugs flowing from Central America, from Mexico into the United States. And why do people you think you can get rid of the drug addiction just by killing the people involved in the drug trade? Often the people who are killed are not drug dealers, but just fishermen who are fishing off the coast of Central America. Or South America, but they get killed, and then the claims were killing the drug dealers. But the reason that the drug business is so profitable is because people in despair want these drugs just to numb their minds, to deal with the sense of meaninglessness. Then we have increasing alcoholism. Violence is an expression of that despair, and crime increases. Just as the text says, the text from the Digha Nikaya, when there's poverty, crime increases. And then we have the psychological consequences, increasing numbers of people suffering from anxiety, depression, and then increasing suicide rate. And then, subtle forms of violence, especially over the internet. So it doesn't have to be violence by people using guns and knives, but just violent communications over the internet, particularly young men bombarding young girls with violent messages. And then many of the girls get upset, miserable, and spiking suicide rate among young girls who can't handle the messages that they get, these violent messages that they get. So we have this disparity of wealth. And then if you do a little research on the internet, there's something put out annually called the World Happiness Report. And you find consistently, year after year, they use various criteria to determine national happiness in a particular country. The countries that always come out highest in the national happiness index are the countries with the highest degree of wealth equality. Of course, there's never perfect wealth equality, but the least inequality. So you need a certain level of material prosperity for there to be happiness. If you have wealth equality, but the country is plunged in poverty, or you have a country where there's people are roughly equal, but they don't have enough to get by for their daily needs, then there's not much happiness. But once you meet the threshold of material security and you can have a little extra for some enjoyment, vacations, to pursue hobbies and so forth, the happiest countries are those with the greatest amount of wealth equality or the least wealth inequality. Those are the countries are Finland, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, I think the Netherlands. Yeah, those are usually the countries that can't come out consistently on top. The United States is pretty far down. I think it's number 26 last year. And I think probably would be further down, but because there is at least a fairly substantial middle class in the United States, that sort of offsets the number of people who are despondent because they're living in poverty. Okay, and then one of the consequences of this disparity of wealth is that the people who have that excess wealth then use that wealth, funneling it, because they have so much wealth that they don't know what to do with. They don't know what to do with it. And when you reach a certain level of material prosperity, okay, you can enjoy your life, you could maybe have a second home, you could go on vacations, enjoy various amenities. But once you get into the multiple billions, the wealth just becomes an abstract figure that becomes an obsession of the mind. But it becomes an object of attachment because it becomes not a means for living a fulfilling life even through material enjoyment, but it becomes a way by which you measure your status, your position, and your power in the society. And then to secure their hold on wealth, they use that extra wealth. Where does it go? At least a fraction of it goes to fund elections. So we have this very corrupt political system in this country, whereby this is a consequence of a decision made back, or at least it started long ago, but it was really accelerated and escalated back in 2010. It was a decision called the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which held that money is speech. And so we have to have free speech in this country. So that means, according to the Supreme Court interpretation, that millionaires and billionaires can use all of their money to fund elections, to donate to elections through establishing what they now call super PACs, political action committees. And so billionaires establish these super PACs where they don't have to disclose individually, who is funding the elections? They just donate to the super PAC, and the super PAC supports the candidates. And so in this way, these billionaires could just support the campaigns of the candidates who are going to serve their interests. And so the democracy becomes skewed and starts turning into an oligarchy, a government in which the wealthy exercise extreme, disproportionate control over the political system. So the American ideal is that everybody has an equal say in the governance of the country, sort of the theoretical ideal, but that's been completely sort of torn to shreds because of the disproportionate role that wealth plays in funding elections. And so we have the candidates who are willing to cater to the needs of the rich are the ones who get the support of the super PACs and come into power. And then the country is sliding from oligarchy into autocracy because we have certain people who are willing to just even throw all of the constitutional restraints on power, throwing it aside and just exercise arbitrary control, not even consulting Congress when there are laws that require them to consult Congress. Like if you want to make any changes to the White House, there's a law which says you have to get congressional approval. But I don't mention names. We have a president who just one day decides he needs a ballroom at the White House. People are starving on the streets. Why do they need a ballroom? And so just knock down overnight the east wing of the White House to start preparation to construct a ballroom. And in many other ways, you just completely disregard Congress, and Congress is just afraid to stand up. When you have a person who has a kind of charismatic, almost magnetic grip over people who are so desperate, the reason people are so desperate because of economic insecurity and fear and resentment, that they're willing to throw their support behind somebody who comes forward and says, I'm going to be your savior. I'm going to be your voice. I'm going to stand up for you. And so these frightened, fearful people throw their support behind them, and then everybody is afraid to stand up against that particular leader. And then we have, so that's the first, is that the movement from at least aspirational democracy towards oligarchy and then towards autocracy. And if there were, I would have to say, somebody more skillful, more clever, more capable in a sinister way in control of the presidency, it would probably be possible for him to turn the country into an autocracy or a dictatorship. But the man in charge is fumbling and just so completely inept and clumsy and incompetent that he's just losing the support. Okay, a second major concern. Is this getting boring? I saw you gave me 45 minutes for the talk. I'm already into an hour.
Not boring. Right on.
Okay.
Telling the truth.
Okay. Okay. The second issue, okay. I think I already at least suggested this, and this is, I say, what I call the systematic assault on the democratic process that's been quietly taking place below the radar. And so I say the health of democracy depends on the integrity of our elections. And that requires that all citizens have the right to vote and to elect the candidates of their choice. We've seen this democratic process being really given several blows over the past few decades. I mentioned already the Citizens United decision. And then very important in the 1965 was the Voting Rights Act, which, after the Civil War, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution gave all Americans the right to vote. And that meant that Black Americans had the right to vote. But in the southern states, the South, all barriers were put up to Black people for voting. Even if you attempted to vote, you risked being lynched, being killed. But then through the civil rights movement of the early 1960s, culminated in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, ensured various measures to ensure that Black people will have the unfettered right, unhindered right to vote, and that they would be able to elect representatives of their choice through the districting process. But then in 2013, there was a Supreme Court decision called the Shelby County decision, which allowed states in the South to create barriers to voting by Black people. And so they started to put up these various measures to make it more difficult. Of course, they don't overtly discriminate on the basis of race, saying you're Black, so you can't vote. But they put up like fewer voting machines in predominantly Black districts, try to stop mail-in voting. Various measures are adopted to make it more difficult to vote. So that became a big obstacle for Black people voting starting in 2013. And then just a month ago, there was a decision called the Kali versus Louisiana decision, which allows states to gerrymander districts in ways that remove or that minimize minority representation in Congress. Already that decision has impacts in that predominantly Black districts in Louisiana and Tennessee were diluted so that the Black vote was, in effect, the Black people can't elect their representatives. The predominantly Black districts were removed in those states. And already in Texas, there was gerrymandering to dilute Black voting. Attempt was made in Alabama, but that was blocked by the courts. And probably other states in the South will take measures to obstruct the voting of Black people. And then the president is trying to push through something called the Save America Act. So far, it's been blocked. And SAVE is an acronym, Save American Voting Integrity. I don't remember what it stands for, but basically it will put up so many obstacles to people voting that it will almost ensure a permanent Republican majority in the country. Okay, so this is the second point that I'm bringing up. The third point is the treatment of refugees and immigrants. We've seen over the past few months, or actually past year, the ICE agents roaming the streets of the cities, cracking down on immigrants in a very cruel, brutal way. Even people, maybe they're undocumented immigrants, but they've been living in the country for 20 years, 30 years. They brought up family in this country. They've been hardworking, doing generally menial jobs that other people don't want to do. They've been contributing members of their communities, paying taxes, but the ICE agents, the Border Patrol agents just tear apart the families, send people, deport them to countries with which they have no previous connection, or send them back to their home countries, even though they're going to face maybe grave dangers in their countries. And so what I say is that we certainly need some kind of reasonable immigration policy, but we also have to find ways to provide hardworking immigrants with a secure place in our society and with a pathway to citizenship. We have these, call them the dreamers. These are children who are brought here, well, actually young adults who have been brought to this country as children by their parents, undocumented, but they've been grown up in this country. They really know no other place is their home, but they can't get citizenship. We have to give them, even though they've lived in this country, many of them have university degrees, they're working at professional jobs, but they can't get citizenship. And the fourth big problem we're facing is the US foreign policy. As soon as the new administration came in, it dismantled the USAID, that's the Agency for International Development. That's what I mentioned at my little 3-minute talk at the American University. So the Agency for International Development had provided American humanitarian assistance to people all around the world. It just took a tiny fraction of the US wealth. I think about 1% of our budget went to foreign assistance through US aid. But it's now been cut off, and as a result, 95 million people in foreign lands have lost access to healthcare, 23 million children deprived of an education, and 3 to 5 million people each year, as predicted, will die preventable deaths. So we're losing our international reputation and standard because of these policies. Instead of collaborating with the rest of the world, we've adopted an increasingly hostile approach to foreign affairs. Most starkly, you've seen this completely irrational, incomprehensible attack on Iran, which is now almost destabilizing the entire world economy. We're sort of caught in a stalemate. The president doesn't know what to do about it. I don't even try to follow the news, what's going on with this confrontation with Iran, because each day is changing. We're going to bomb them out of existence. Oh, we're almost on the approach of a settlement with Iran. Oh, I've had a very good talk with the Iranian negotiators. They won't accept our position. We can't accept their demands. It just changes so rapidly but completely unnecessary. And then what we're doing maybe doesn't get much a high spot in the news, but we're strangling the economy of Cuba. So millions of people, no energy, they're not getting any fuel. So the hospitals have become non-functional. People can't cook their food. We're trying to destroy the country because the president doesn't like their government. And then we're now spending $1 trillion per year on the military budget, but the president not happy with that, or the Defense Department not happy with that. They say we want $1.5 trillion for our military to beef up the military. And how are they going to get that funding for the military? More cuts to social welfare programs. Okay, then the fifth sort of challenge that we're facing today, and this is probably in the long run, probably the most critical, and that is the reversals that have taken place in our environmental policies. So just this past February, well, actually, when the new administration came in, the US again withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords. The administration declared a national energy emergency. So to meet that emergency, they say, we have to explore more sources of oil and gas. And now they're promoting the revitalization of coal as a source of energy, the most polluting of all sources of energy. And then this past February, these, now we put in quotation marks, the Environmental Protection Agency repealed the endangerment finding, and that served as the legal basis for regulating greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles and power plants. Okay, so those are the 5 challenges that we're facing, and how to meet those challenges. You know, I'm not a political strategist, the theorist, I don't know. But I said what we need is a kind of guiding vision, at least to inspire us and mobilize us. And I drew upon at least one potential vision, is the vision that we use for the relief organization that I established, Buddhist Global Relief. So I could read that vision statement, that we are inspired by the vision of a world in which degrading poverty has been banished, a world in which everyone can acquire the basic material supports of a meaningful life, food, clothing, housing, and healthcare, a world in which everyone can enjoy a satisfactory level of education and pursue the things that give their life meaning and purpose, a world in which people can dwell in peace and harmony with one another and with the natural environment. And so I say that's a visionary statement, idealistic, aspirational, unrealistic, but that's the kind of world that we should be striving to create. I say that's the world that accords with what I call the world-sustaining aspect of the Dhamma. And so it's the kind of vision that should motivate us to make fundamental changes in our social and economic policies. And to implement those policies, we have to have political agents who are willing to implement those kind of policies, politicians who are, say, devoted to a morally uplifting vision of what kind of country they want to establish, what kind of administration they want to establish, who are willing to look maybe just like the Buddha says in those discourses, to seek out wise ascetics and Brahmins, to come to them and ask what is good, what is bad, what is wholesome, what is unwholesome, what leads to well-being and flourishing, what leads to harm and degradation. And so I would say we need people with that kind of political vision. There are a few people in the political process, in the political administration, who do have that vision. I'm not supposed to say names, but the person who inspired me over several years with the kind of vision, pushing for the kind of society, would be Bernie Sanders, who came very, very close. I don't think he would have been able to function within the political system that we have now, but he's the one who has that kind of vision that could be passed down to the younger generation. But those are the kind of people who are willing to accept that kind of vision and to put it into, make it part of our policies. And I think what we need, this is a rather wild idea that I would have, is that in our educational system, all the emphasis is on educating students to pursue a career. But I think beginning really at elementary school level, what's needed to be introduced into the educational system is ethical and spiritual teachings, not promoting any one religion, which is a rather risky proposition because it could get like fundamentalist Christian visions of agendas being pushed through the schools. But let's say a non-sectarian where you take the ethical teachings of the great religions, the great moral thinkers. Probably at the city of 10,000 Buddhas, they have the instilling goodness, and one is the elementary school, the other is the high school, instilling goodness. What is it? Virtue. Developing virtue. Developing virtue. Okay, instilling goodness, I think it's the elementary school, and instilling goodness, establishing virtue, developing virtue for the high school students. And so they get, and I think it's not only Buddhist teachings, probably they will get exposure to Confucianism, maybe they get Plato and Aristotle, maybe not at the high school level, but maybe some other ethical teachings. So when you get students trained in ethical thinking from an early age, and not only in ethics, but also when I was I think in elementary school or high school, they used to be a course in civics, which I used to find so boring, but I recognize now is so important. It teaches one's responsibilities as a citizen. So if you have courses like that, and then students imbibe the ethical values and the idea of this, their civic responsibilities, then when they reach maturity, then they will know how to bring into being the kind of politicians that we need, but also to have a good political system. I have to say, and this is almost where there's a vicious cycle that I don't know how to break. One needs at least a fair degree of economic equality. You'll never get perfect equality, but you have to eliminate those glaring disparities of wealth. Because when you have glaring disparities of wealth, on the one hand, amongst those who are sort of pushed out into the bottom of the economic system, you have complete disillusionment with the whole political system. And those are people who won't vote at all. They think nobody is concerned with my interests. But then you have people in the lower middle brackets who live in a perpetual state of, they call this economic precarity, economic anxiety. This would be like the lower middle class who are afraid of being pushed out, pushed down into the levels of the poor. And those are the people who become very responsive to the claims of an aspiring autocrat or authoritarian figure. And then you have the extremely wealthy people who use their wealth to control the political system. So when you have greater economic equality, then you have much, and people are not living in poverty, not beset by that economic anxiety, constant fear of being dropped down into poverty, then they will make reasonable choices and bring into power. Then politics becomes something very boring. You might have said this will be another change that we need in the political system, because now we just have two political parties. It seems almost as a frozen political system. So if I were to remodel a political system, first I would have, I think it's called ranked choice voting. So it's not the case that you just vote for one candidate over the other, but you have a choice of, like you have like six parties, six candidates, and then you rank your choices, my first choice, second choice, third choice. And this way you calculate all the different choices, so you get much more diversity, variety in the political system, and a much greater range of choices. Okay, but I don't know how to change the system. But what we have to do is I have to say, amongst many Buddhists, there's an attitude I'm not interested in politics. It's just worldly matters. Not interested. I'm just doing my mindfulness practice, my meditation. But we have to have a sense of responsibility. And I like to use this image. Well, actually, first week, I actually have two images. One comes from Martin Luther King, who used this image. He said that we are, I don't forget the exact words, we are all tied together in this garment of a shared destiny, so that what one person does directly affects few people, but it indirectly impacts everyone. So that's the image that Martin Luther King used. And I would take the Buddhist image from the Avatamsaka Sutra, or the Huayan philosophy of Indra's net, with the jewels, the net, in which each intersection of the threads is a jewel, and each jewel reflects every other jewel, and each jewel in turn is reflected in every other jewel. And so this maybe represents, we say, the whole society or even the whole global community of living beings or sentient beings. So we all, each person is reflected in the mind stream of every other person, and all the other people are reflected in some way in our own mind stream. And that implies that we are responsible to our own choices and decisions for the whole, even if we just have one voice, one vote, but that vote, in a sense, spreads out and impacts all the other jewels within the system. And so it shows the necessity of taking responsibility for the whole, developing the sense, I call this conscientious compassion, that we have a sense of conscience which motivates us to take responsibility. We take responsibility through compassion, because our responsibility is to ensure that we create a society, a world in which we lift people up from suffering, and we create the conditions where everybody can flourish to the best of their capacity. So maybe with that, I could bring my little talk to an end. And if anybody has questions or suggestions, maybe other people have better ideas. I say it, I'm just what do I say? I'm a stupid monk who doesn't know very much about the world.